Hello and welcome. Welcome to the webinar series of the Global Network of Psychologists for Human Rights and International Council of Psychologists. This is our second year of the series. It means that this is our first webinar in this year, and altogether it's the seventh from the very beginning. We tried to match our topics of the webinars with the important dates from the website of the United Nations. And for this month, for February, because we wanted to give a fair chance to the even months this year. Last year we had all the topics covered in the odd months. This February, we are covering actually two topics. We can match two important dates in February with this one topic that we have today. So our topic is tackling cross-national and cross-cultural perspectives related to human rights and psychology. And the important UN dates are the 4th of February, International Day of Human Fraternity, and the 20th of February, World Day of Social Justice. I'm very happy to say that we have two excellent speakers today. They are Dr. Ayorkor Gaba and Dr. Rashmi Jaipal. Our moderator today is going to be Elison Santos from Brazil. And your lovely hostesses will be Mary Bullock, and my name is Marlena Plavšić. Let me tell you a few things about, well, logistics, so that you know what will happen during the webinar. First, let me introduce the organizations that are hosting. The first one is, well, they are both equally important. Global Network of Psychologists for Human Rights. It's a network of psychologists that you can reach on the website that is shown here. We regularly publish monthly newsletters, so you can find topics that we cover there each month. You can join by adding contributions for education and blogs as well. So join us and read what we have for you. International Council of Psychologists is committed to promoting human rights, dignity, and justice, and you can find more information on the website that is shown here. So, some information for you. We will have first the presentations, and then we will have time for discussion. The way you can start the discussion is to put your questions in the chat box or in the Q&A function that you have on Zoom. Then some of you are interested in the certificates of attendance. We will issue them automatically as long as you attend the webinar for at least 40 minutes. Also, if you need, you can find the closed caption function on your Zoom, which is on the bottom of the screen. So let me give floor to Elison.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you and with these two wonderful speakers that we are going to listen today. Today, we're going to listen Dr. Ayorkor Gaba. She is an assistant professor at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. Her research aims to reduce health disparities, advance health equity, and address social determinants of health. And also here with us, Dr. Rashmi Jaipal. She's a professor emerita at Bloomfield College, New Jersey. Her work is on immigration, acculturation, psychology, and sustainable development, cultural conceptions of health and healing, and cross-cultural communication. So now, I give the floor to Dr. Gaba, please. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today. I hope everyone can see my slides. My name is Ayorkor Gaba. I'm happy to be here today to discuss with you human rights through a cultural lens. My talk will focus on human rights and mental health in Africa. Sorry, I'm going to stop sharing. 1 second. I had an issue here. Please bear with the technical difficulties here. Sorry about that. Okay, sorry about that. Before I get started, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a US-based clinical psychologist and treatment researcher. My work centers around advancing behavioral health equity with a specific focus on human rights and equity-based approaches to improving mental health care for people who've been systematically marginalized. I'm also an APA NGO rep to the United Nations and worked with a group of great psychologists around issues related to global health. And today's talk is personal for me. I'm an immigrant from Nigeria. And I was born in Kano and lived my formative years in Lagos. Okay. Today, I'll focus on the intersection of human rights, mental health, and social cultural considerations in advancing human rights in Africa. I speak today, and I'm deeply conscious of the assumptions often made in speaking about Africa, as though it's a place which can be discussed in a generalized way with many, it has many countries, many languages, many people. So it is not a monolith, but I will speak today collectively about Africa because of the shared sociocultural commonalities in history and belief systems.
Ayurkor,
Yes?
I cannot see the PowerPoint.
Oh, you can't see it?
No, the screen is not shared.
I am so sorry about that. Can you see it now?
Yes, yes, thank
All
you.
right. Okay, sorry about that. All right. So first, let me set the stage with what is being reported about human rights in Africa. For decades, Africa has been plagued with human rights abuses and has been called out for being a hotspot for human rights violations. The 2022 Human Rights Watch report reveals that human rights violations are worsening in many countries and now flaring up in other countries that do not have a previous history of such types of human rights violations. COVID has made things much, much worse. Severe COVID-related restrictions like lockdowns and the related enforcement of these lockdowns have triggered human rights abuses, ranging from arbitrary arrests, beatings, government-sanctioned killings. We've also seen during COVID an increase in domestic and gender-based violence in most African countries. And of course, when we see sort of these increases, the most impacted are vulnerable groups, including immigrants, migrants, ethnic minorities. And then we are also seeing that women and girls are hardest hit by the human rights violations that have flared up even more during COVID. I'll center my talk around mental health, and in terms of mental health specifically and human rights in African countries, we see that recently between 2000 and 2015, the number of years lost to disability as a result of mental health and substance use disorders increased by 52%. Experts say this is going to increase exponentially over the coming years. So this is something that is really important to think about as we're thinking about human rights. And some of the reasons why we see these increases is related to low funding. In places like Gambia, only 0.5% of the health budget is focused on mental health. In places like Ghana, that's only 1.3%. We also see there's a lack of community-based models. For many countries, the only services that are available are psychiatric hospitals and not community-based models for mental health. There's really no care in rural areas to even places with low amount of services to access them. You have to go into the cities to do that. Many services are provided by religious or cultural leaders where there's little regulation about sort of how those services are implemented. And there's beliefs and stigma around mental health in many countries, beliefs around sort of supernatural reasons for why there are mental health issues and stigma about getting help. And across African countries, there's a lack of providers who are trained in providing mental health care. We have to also acknowledge some of the successes and progress in the last 10 years. One being the Mental Health Leadership and Advocacy Program, which is a program that works at the country-specific level to think about mental health services and enhance development around those services. Many countries are implementing community health worker training, where community health workers are trained to provide things like for mental health first aid and mental health services. There's some countries implementing mobile outreach teams to prevent mental health problems. And then also this growing piece of integrating peer support. So those are folks with lived experience with mental health conditions as part of community health worker teams to go out into the community and especially into rural communities to address mental health. So there's been some progress made despite challenges. I'd like to highlight this particular study. Human rights, especially for those with mental health conditions in most African countries, continue to be reported poor at best and non-existent at worst. This 2022 study is evaluating the quality of care and the respect for human rights in psychiatric facilities in 4 Western African countries, the Gambia, Ghana, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. And we see here that most rights were either poorly promoted or just outright abused. I want to highlight here just a tool. You know, I always like to have tools in my toolkit when I'm doing my work. It's a toolkit called the Quality Rights Toolkit, which is based on the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And it's a really excellent toolkit to utilize to assess and improve quality and human rights standards in mental health and social care facilities. What is often not discussed when or reported when we talk about the human rights issues in Africa is the prevailing impact of colonization and ongoing efforts by Africans to address human rights. This 3-phase framework is a very helpful framework to understand the role of colonization and where we are at right now in many African countries around human rights. Conte proposes this 3-phase model where in phase 1, which was pre-colonization, was marked by traditional African values, which really aligned nicely with a lot of human rights lens and policies and laws, where the African values around things like right to life, right to free movement, obligation to provide for others, those were really sort of part of African culture pre-colonization. And mental health problems were acknowledged and seen as part of a complex, faceted array of mental, physical, emotional, and supernatural causes. And treatment was really using a breadth of holistic and social approaches, including approaches that were based on strengths and resilience. Phase 2 was ushered in by colonization, which was marked by denial of rights by colonizers and the purposeful, and I want to emphasize the purposeful destruction of Africans' concepts of human rights. With colonization came the importation of Western concept of the self and internalized views about a sort of a colonial mentality, meaning that the values and the beliefs of colonizers started to replace sort of these Central African values that we know were there prior to colonization. And then phase 3 came in, and phase 2 really resulted in detrimental transgenerational transmission of this disconnection from self and others, and also trauma. That set the stage for phase 3, which kind of became ushered in 1945 with the Universal Declaration of Rights, and then subsequent development of efforts to address human rights from an African lens. And I just included a slide here of some of the great work that had started in phase 3, which really set the stage for the first formal collection of many African countries working together towards development, peace, and human rights, which most of this work continues today. So this is a list of some of the human rights instruments. And on the right-hand side here, you see the most recent commission in Africa that was occurred in October and November of 2022 that focused on human rights.
Ayurko, you said you want me to say when you have 5 minutes left.
All right, thank you. Even with these African-led human rights efforts, there still continues to be substantial challenges in the implementation of human rights protections, monitoring, and enforcement. And so why is that? African scholars really point to neo-colonialism as being sort of a lasting piece that continues to impact human rights today. Neocolonialism is the use of political and economic pressures by developed countries, especially colonial powers, to dominate and control less developed countries, mostly former colonies. This trickles down into mental health because many of our mental health approaches take a neocolonialism perspective in addressing mental health. So you'll see a lot of top-down approaches, a lack of consultation with local communities, discounting cultural strengths and resilience. And I really sort of call on our field to start thinking about, as someone who works in cultural adaptation, and my colleague, Dr. Jaipal as well, that to really think about how are we being neo-colonialist in our approaches to mental health when we import interventions and approaches in other countries. So some recommendations that we've heard from African scholars: we need to engage key cultural stakeholders, especially youth and elders, draft human rights instruments in African languages. Most of them are in English, and most of them are using sort of Western and European idioisms to describe human rights and mental health. Take a bottom-up approach. Also, name the impact of colonialism and neo-colonialism on human rights and mental health, and accompany that with accountability for multinational corporations who continue to engage in human rights abuses in these countries. And then also really discount this approach of taking approaches or systems from one country and implementing them in another country without intentional consideration about adaptation. So this was sort of a high-level overview of some of these issues. If you're looking for two good reading options here to really get in depth about this, I sort of suggest the book on the left, which my chapter around this issue is in, and the book on the right is an amazing book about Africa and human rights. And I will thank you so much for your time and attention. I really look forward to our discussion. I'll turn it over to you, Rashmi, or Allison.
Yes, well, now we are going to listen to Dr. Jaipal, and then we open for discussions, right? Welcome, Dr. Jaipal.
Thank you. I'm just going to thank you very much. I'm just trying to get this on presentation mode, but anyway, I want to just follow up on what Ayoko was saying. Is really very, very relevant to what I'm initially going to talk about. So while I don't know why this is not allowing me to, sorry. Anyway, I'll figure it out. But so
it's the icon at the very bottom that looks like.
I know, but I can't get to it because my bar, the bar is obstructing the view, and I'm trying to. Okay, wait here. Now I've got it. All right. Okay, so sorry. After all the practice sessions, anyway. So first, I want to briefly discuss human rights and mental health care in India to follow up on what Ayoko was saying. Was very pertinent and relevant. And then I'll talk more about how the human rights concept, does it apply universally or not? And some long-standing critiques of it or issues with it. So first of all, the World Health Organization Mental Health Action Plan of 2010 says that LMICs, as Ayoko was saying, talking about, have a gap or lack of access to mental health care for the bulk of the population, and that mentally ill are subjected to a lot of human rights violations like stigmatization and inhumane treatment and so on. So this is all true. There's some egregious human rights violations that they're subjected to, but all this is true but misleading because the situation is actually more complex. There is a gap in access to Western psychiatric care, but there are also a lot of widespread access to a variety of traditional indigenous methods of treatment and folk medicine, which are ignored by mainstream medicine. Some traditional methods of treatment can lead to egregious violations of human rights. But as Ayoko was saying about the African situation, some indigenous traditional methods also have a holistic approach that promotes mental and physical health. And emerging research shows traditional healers can be effective and a source of comfort and support. And anyway, they're the first port of call for a majority of the population. So what's interesting also is that in 2019, the World Health Organization issued a global report on traditional and complementary medicine, in contrast to the earlier report that states that people in LMICs do in fact have access to healthcare in the form of traditional and complementary medicine. And this fills a gap in healthcare services. So actually there isn't a gap as they thought. In fact, WHO has been encouraging national governments and LMICs to recognize and invest in TNCM. 40 African states now have a national policy on TNCM. 10 countries in the Southeast Asia region have a program, office, and expert committee for TNCM. That's traditional complementary medicine. So recognition of the value of traditional healing practices and their integration into healthcare is now a growing movement in many countries. And I assume this is also the case for the traditional African values as well. So now, though, to switch gears, I want to look at how human rights are perceived in LMICs. Why are there long-standing debates between member states of the UN, such as the Asian values debate, challenging the universality of the notion of human rights? And can cross-cultural and indigenous psychology shed light on these differences in how human rights are conceptualized? These disciplines are usually never applied to analyzing and understanding social and legal issues like human rights. They're in fact not well known and seen as irrelevant to these issues, but they are relevant because cross-cultural psychology looks at how cultural context shapes early formation of psychological structures and functioning at an implicit subconscious level, and how it influences a moral relationship between the individual and their social context. This has a bearing on how the notion of human rights, conceived of. So this is a complex and controversial topic that cannot be adequately covered actually in such a short talk. But the hope is that if cross-cultural and indigenous psychology can be added to the discussion on human rights, it could deepen the understanding of different cultural perspectives that rest in underlying cultural conditioning. So I'll discuss some classical findings from cross-cultural psychology research and Indian indigenous psychology to explore whether it has equivalent concepts. So to begin, dismissing culturally different perspectives on human rights may be problematic. The human rights, according to the classical definition, is classic civil liberties and political rights, such as the freedom of right to life and freedom and liberty, freedom of thought, freedom of opinion and expression, and so on. And the UN Charter states that these fundamental human rights are universal and aims for them to be universally implemented. But not all member states at the UN agree, stating that human rights grew out of a Western individualistic social context and putting forward cultural difference as a rationale for a different formulation. The Bangkok Declaration made by Asian countries at the World Conference on Human Rights in 1993 challenged the universality of human rights. They issued a joint statement that the diverse and rich cultures and traditions of Asia need to be better recognized, and the imposition of incompatible values are to be avoided. This is similar to what Ayoko was saying about the African movement. This is an ongoing thorny issue for intergovernmental negotiations. Non-Western countries claim it is used by Western countries to interfere with their national sovereignty. At the 2009 UN Human Rights Council, and again in 2011 and 12, proposal was floated to incorporate traditional values and make it the basis of universal human rights. But bringing in cultural values raises the issue of moral relativism. Cultural values are used to justify practices of, for example, female genital mutilation or child marriage and so on. And the women's movement sees traditional values as a justification for oppressive patriarchal social structures. So the Bangkok Declaration was considered to be successfully defeated by the non-NGO declaration in 1993, which was led by the International Women's Movement. But people disagree that the Asian values position was defeated. A big mistake Westerners make is the perception that Asian values is only a ploy on the part of the elite Asian political class and that all other Asians agree with our idea of human rights. But many people in Asia will have views about social organization, responsibility, duty, and right, which are not the same as those of human rights. And in fact, people want to speak the language of human rights, who may want to be involved in social justice projects, and yet who also have real differences of outlook. So also early on, political scientists stated that human rights is a Western construct with limited applicability. There is an assumption that human rights values based on the atomized individual are paramount and ought to be extended to the non-Western world. But traditional cultures don't view the individual as autonomous, possessed of rights above and prior to society, but as they are part of a social group. So these differences sound a lot like the individualism, collectivism research in cross-cultural psychology. Research shows that cultural differences in the relationship between the individual and social environment varies. There are varying degrees to which individuals see themselves as psychologically separate from versus embedded in their social context. So could it be that these Asian values challenges are based on real psychological differences in IC? These cultural differences have to do with the implicit culture beneath our conscious awareness, the subconscious cultural conditioning that occurs through early child-rearing practices of enculturation and socialization that forms the lens through which we perceive the world and that influences our values and normative behavior. Classical early research shows in cross-cultural psychology shows cultural differences in IC, meaning individualism, collectivist social norms, values, self, and morality that have a bearing on how rights are conceived of differently. IC is the main factor that differentiates between cultures and is defined as two different value orientations that prioritize protecting the individual and placing the goals of the individual above the group's goals versus maintaining group harmony and placing group goals above the individual's goals. The studies on the self show differences in the collectivist, interdependent, connected self versus the individualistic, autonomous, independent self. Many studies have shown that India is collectivist in its value orientation, and the extended family unit is the main unit and marked by interdependence and sharing of resources. And the main goal is to maintain the well-being of the family. Indian indigenous psychologists view the self as connected and existing within a social, spiritual, and divine context. So to become part of the group, community, and divinity are the goals of self-realization. And according to recent research, although globalization is bringing about changes in these values and family structures, spiritual and collectivist values persist. They seem to be deeply rooted. So this early childhood play a central role in the inculcation and transmission of implicit cultural values and norms. Sleeping arrangements or bodily contact with the mother affects the development of the self, interdependent or independent. And morality is affected by this. The Indians emphasize relationships, and there's a heightened moral expectation to care and be cared for by others that keeps the person embedded in the in-group is seen as, again, helping in-group members is seen as a moral duty regardless of personal needs or dislikes. So I'm going to skip over a lot of the research, but basically cross-cultural I see differences in self and morality seem to relate to human rights across culture, because individualistic value-oriented societies tend to emphasize civil and political rights, The moral obligation here is to protect the freedom of the individual against oppression by others, the group, and society. The collectivist value-oriented societies tend to emphasize economic and social rights. And the moral obligation here is to take care of others and fulfill role responsibilities to maintain the group. So notions of how to protect the individual seems to vary with individualism and collectivism. But now let's come to indigenous psychology. What about the concepts of Indian indigenous psychology, and are there equivalent moral concepts? The moral concept of human rights is that the conviction that all human beings, by virtue of being born human, are entitled to basic rights prior to and separate from their social context. But in Hindu thought, dharma and karma are the central moral concepts. Dharma, or the primordial natural law that maintains cosmic and social order, is a very complex concept with many layers of meaning: duty, virtue, morality, but also it refers to the power which upholds the universe and society and that underlies right behavior and social order. And it has two aspects: varnashrama dharma, duties of caste or station in life, and sadharana or common dharma, fundamental moral duties to all, that include truth-telling and non-injury, etc. It's based on the belief that the same divinity exists in all. So karma, the second concept, is, or action, is associated with dharma. Past good conduct or right action in alignment with dharma leads to good outcomes or earned privileges in the present and future. Rights as privileges are earned through good karma and was used to justify the rigid entrenchment of caste or varnashrama dharma. Whereas common dharma, based on the divinity in all creatures, seems to contradict caste dharma and overrules it, as evidenced by reform movements over the centuries, such as Buddhism, Jainism, or the Bhakti movement.
Rashmi, you have 2 more minutes.
Okay, so basically from this exploration, there does not seem to be an equivalent concept to human rights in the Hindu tradition. If karma is taken as a comparison, then the matching concept is earned privileges, the outcome of good actions. But in the human rights discourse, it is an unearned entitlement based simply on being human. If you take the concept of dharma, then moral conduct, duties, and obligations towards all are the matching concepts. They're not really equivalent either, since they're responsibilities and not entitlements. Common dharma, if you take, is based on the oneness of all creatures, and it becomes the basis for universal human responsibilities rather than universal human rights. And also cultural conditioning, as we said, of the individual varies with IC and affects morality. So all this contributes to serious differences in outlooks referred to earlier. And in general, cultural differences cannot be easily dismissed. In order to achieve a more universal agreement on human rights, it may be necessary to incorporate cross-cultural psychology research and draw from local indigenous traditions of thought. So to conclude, interestingly enough, the issue of cultural differences was expressed right at the start. I will end with a quote from one of the architects of the Human Rights Charter herself, Eleanor Roosevelt, who wrote in her memoirs on the drafting of the Declaration of Universal Human Rights in 1948 that Dr. Chang was a pluralist and held forth in charming fashion on the proposition that there is more than one kind of ultimate reality. The declaration, he said, should reflect more than simply Western ideas and would have to be eclectic in approach. And I remember that at one point, Dr. Chang suggested that the Secretariat might well spend a few months studying the fundamentals of Confucianism. He was anticipating indigenous and cross-cultural psychology. So with that, I'll end. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much to both of you, Ayorkar and Hansini. It was beautiful and wonderful to listen to you, and also for us to learn about the differences in the regions of our world. Well, I have one question for you both. You both spoke about the colonization and the influence of colonization in Africa and Asia, and also the individualism and collectivism, the idea of being, how challenged how challenging is it to differentiate how traditions have been influenced by colonization and how it is from the people, from the history of the people before colonization. I don't know if you understood the question. Is it possible to differentiate, and how do you see these in the challenge of psychology?
Ayoka, you want to go first?
Sure, that's a great question. So I think there are a couple issues there. I think with colonization first, part of your question is how do we know that colonization has sort of changed the traditional or pre-colonization concepts of human rights in these different areas. One, I think that's a really important piece of colonization is to destroy history, right? Part of colonization is an intentional approach to destroying people's history. And I think the way that you can sort of identify if there have been changes is really to go back to those people in that country and that land and really hearing from elders, hearing the stories that are passed down from generation to generation that weren't destroyed as part of colonization. But that is a big challenge because it's an intentional destruction of people's histories and lands and artifacts and other things. I also think it's also a complicated question because colonization did not stop. Right? It just changed names. It changed to neo-colonization. It changed to globalization. So it's still ongoing. So I want to really emphasize that part of the tricky piece here is that we have to acknowledge that it just changed names. It changed to companies. It changed to sanctioned ways of abuses that we agree to as all parts of members of this world. So I just want to also acknowledge that piece of things that makes it tricky because it's still ongoing.
Yes, and I want to add that for example, in India, the colonizers, when the British came, the problem is they didn't really respect local, medical traditions, traditional medicine, folk medicine that the bulk of the population have been using for centuries, literally thousands of years. So what they did is that they suppressed, a lot of them, they sort of suppressed the whole category of traditional medicine. They persecuted the healers, the medical practice purveyors, the folk medical people. They sort of tried to obliterate that and replace it with Western medicine. So it was very overt, to try to wipe out the traditional ways, because they also, from their point of view, they saw it as very backward, superstitious. They didn't understand it at all. And they didn't understand, they thought also that the Western way of being, this individualistic way of being, separate from context, and which human rights comes out of, the conceptualization of human rights, that is the way to be and has to be spread around the world. And that's why, as Ayoka was saying, in Africa, the African movement to try to resurrect the traditional values, and in India, and not just India, in the World Health Organization now saying that traditional complementary medicine, it should be encouraged, in trying to encourage countries that were colonized to revive it and bring it back, because they do have great value, and there's a lot of emerging research now to show it. So there is a distinct difference. I mean, there were distinct differences in how people, before and after kind of scenarios, before the British came and after, in the case of India anyway.
Great. Well, we have some participation here from our colleagues, and Sonia Sushday, she said, well,
Hi, Sonia.
So is globalization the same as colonization?
I think Ayoka, you want to go? It's neo-colonization, I think is what
it's neo-colonialization, and I think globalization is part of that that package of neo-colonization, where previous colonizers come back to former, in the case of Africa, come back to former colonies and exert power and pressure through economic and social intervention. So, for example, in parts of Nigeria, the oil companies that have invaded those lands, destroyed those lands in terms of the environmental abuses to those lands, where you are now seeing places where people cannot sustain a living, they cannot sustain food and agriculture because of environmental disasters that happen there. So I do see those as kind of two parts of a coin. It's neo-colonialism and globalization is part of that, because these corporations are able to come to these countries and sort of have their way in terms of their resources. But I also want to acknowledge that also mental health does that in a way, right? Our field does that in a way. We develop these treatments, and I'm someone who's trained in evidence-based therapies, and we push that our evidence is the right evidence. It's the correct evidence that needs to be imported somewhere and adapted to sort of fix things. And I really question that approach to mental health as well. And we need to sort of think about, when we're thinking about cultural adaptations or thinking about how to improve global mental health, is there a way to do it that it's not top down, where Western models of mental health are considered sort of the premier models that need to be adapted? Are there things that we can learn from other countries in terms of how they approach mental health, and to think about some of these indigenous and sort of older traditions in African and Indian culture that can really boost prevention, which I'm really big into prevention, and also treatment of mental health issues.
Yes, and also the globalization is bringing with it this consumer, it's spreading consumer culture at a huge rate all over the world, which is really based on a Western free market, unregulated free market model of consumerism, and carries with it implicit values around individualism. So it is, for better or worse, I mean, there's some positives and negatives, it's not all bad, but it is bringing about a lot of change in terms of traditional values and so on. And it's a form of it's a form of colonization, because it's kind of ironing out, or trying to iron out anyway, many of the older forms. But on the other hand, a lot of these traditional cultures are resilient and are also trying to integrate and incorporate some of these values and also retain their own values. So it's very complex. I mean, it's not a black and white issue.
And it's very interesting. Well, we have here another comment now from Haji Prabhu Kanganathan from India, and says that eating beef is treated as crime in some places of India. Victims face more violence. And I think this is one of these specifics from each country, from each region, that is a challenge for us, right? For example, here in ICP, we have an interest group that is about decolonizing psychology. That is something that Dr. Gaba was speaking about, how in mental health we also treat psychology in a different way. But how can we do this? How can we use psychology in a better way? How can we build bridges to do as we are doing here, and how can we improve that to help this, to address better this issue?
Well, there are attempts to integrate. The way forward is not to sort of either the whole thing of assimilating to Western mental health models and rejecting the traditional models, or going the other extreme and rejecting Western mental health models and going towards indigenous, but more to try to integrate and see what applies in each context. It requires a lot of work, but it would be, and there's a lot of work now on integrating or trying to integrate these different approaches to mental health, and not just dismissing or discarding traditional local models. And there's some interesting research on that also. So that's the way forward, but it would require work. But even in cross-cultural research, that is the way forward. I mean, people are trying to do that more and more.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you just said, Rashmi. And I think also just to build on that, I think it's important as we're thinking about mental health to always think about the community perspective, that often we come in with our own solutions, and it's important to be intentional and take the time. Often these things take time to just listen to the experiences, to listen to some of and identify strengths and resiliencies that can be built up as a way to prevent some mental health issues, and also to treat mental health problems. I think that's a big piece of things, is really coming in and taking the non-expert role and just listening. I think things like this are very helpful as well. I know that maybe we have some trainees and students here as well, that doing things like this early in your education to really expose yourself to other ways of thinking about mental health and other critical thoughts about mental health is a huge piece in changing our future around these types of issues. And I do think the education that we have around psychology, psychiatry, social work, mental health do need to incorporate more of these issues, because I know in my training I didn't get a lot of this until sort of later on. So I think that's another piece that's really important.
Yes, I think that's so important, Ayoka. I was really surprised to find that over the years there's been a decrease or less and less of cross-cultural psychology training or diversity training in that sense, looking at, and especially in healthcare and in the medical system, but also in the psychological, in the mental health system, that students now are not being taught as much as they were. At least when I was a graduate student at the beginning, and there was much more of an emphasis on it. And now there seems to be less. So that's a huge way we could really start to see a revival of this going forward.
Right. Well, there are some other questions and comments here. Very good. I think, for example, Desiree Howlett, she said, I work internationally with many cultures in a small camp, and I have learned that I basically have to throw out all the Western theories and listen more to the individual. They teach us. I think this individual perspective, this is also very important for our practice, right? And there is a question from Carla Orff. She says, well, your critics are well taken that Western models are often not appropriate, but how would you address harmful indigenous practices, such as ostracization of mentally ill or cultural practices that harm others but are culturally acceptable?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because that also brings up the whole issue of where human rights, the whole concept of human rights can be very useful in terms of protecting the person who's mentally ill from these egregious practices. And there have been examples, in India, I know that there's a real focus now on, or there has been, more emphasis now on trying to protect the mentally ill from some of these practices because of some horrendous incidents that occurred a few years ago. And so now people are trying, the medical establishment is trying to do better and protect them. And one interesting example of this is where in a temple, often what happens is the mentally ill, and people from India who are listening in would know this, are taken to temples in the traditional way. They're seen, if they're hearing voices and so on, they're seen as being possessed, and they're taken to a temple where they sometimes get shackled and starved or beaten or something to drive out the evil spirit. And what recently has been happening, speaking to psychiatrists in India about this, is that they have a model now where they will go, the psychiatrist in a local hospital, a mental health, a psychiatric hospital, will go into the temple and offer their services and collaborate with the priests and say, look, if you bring, the patients are coming to you, we can help you treat them in our way, and you see if that helps you or not. And that's been a very successful way to help the patients avoid some of these more extreme practices, because the priests also are realizing that, this does work, medication works, and it's we don't have to do all these things to this poor person. So there's some. This is a small step forward. This is not widespread yet, but a few years ago, I know this was beginning, and that hopefully this kind of model of integration between mainstream psychiatric healthcare and local traditional practices is growing. You know. Mm-hmm.
And that is an excellent question, I think, and always the struggle with this particular issue. And I do agree that integration is a big part of it. I think also I think I saw a question in the chat or in the questions here about, are there other disciplines that we need to be partnering with? I think another discipline that we need to think about is history. I think some of these practices, when we think about them, lack sort of the original foundation of what the intervention was. So for example, some of these practices morphed over time, and people really experience it as, this is part of my culture. But when you learn about your culture and realize that, no, actually, even though supernatural pieces were part of mental health in sort of traditional African society, mental health was actually more multifaceted. It was physical health, it was nutrition, it was movement, and educating folks about, wow, part of that history was lost, and let's sort of re-embrace the multifaceted way in which we can approach mental health issues and treat people with mental health conditions. I think that would also, and again, this takes time, I think that also changes the dynamic that happens around human rights.
Yeah, that's so good, Ayoka, what you're saying, because also it's the holistic perspective. The traditional model has always been holistic in both Africa and India. The traditional medical practices have a holistic approach which embraces many facets. And so that's, again, if one utilizes that approach more and more, or brings that back, that might help. But also, I just wanted to, I was just remembering that some the traditional and folk healers are beginning also, I've been hearing that they also feel a bit overwhelmed by the current kinds of mental health problems that their local communities bringing to them. And they themselves are coming and asking psychiatrists because they don't really know how to deal with it. The traditional kinds of mental health problems they dealt with and they knew how to deal with through their traditional practices, some of them involving human rights violations. Now they are feeling like a little out of their depth. And so that's also making them more open to changing their practices and coming and asking, talking to psychiatrists about what to do. So that's another interesting development.
Right. Well, Dila Royantina, she asks, what is the significance of holding this webinar? And I think this goes in the direction of the importance of the dialogue and intercultural conversation to improve psychology, right? Do you agree with that? Because once we have to respect the cultures, but I think that we grow very much when we get to know each other, get to know the other cultures with respect. That is like the opposite of colonization, right? And what do you think about that? How can we make it, well, is there a positive globalization of knowledge, of meeting each other? Is it possible, or is it something that we are doing here?
I do think there could be a very positive impact of meeting. I mean, you know, when you think about sort of bias training and all that, it's about exposing yourself to other points of views, but also exposing yourself with an open mind and not to sort of oppress other points of views. And it seems like people who would be coming to something like this would be open to that. So I do think this is part of the so the process. I think part of the process is raising awareness, and then part of that is creating a plan for action. Right? Awareness is part of the solution, but then you have to take that awareness and act on it. So this is definitely part of the process and the journey of getting to a better place around these issues.
Yes, as absolutely, and as you know, one of the initiatives that's been going on for a while is the internationalization of psychology, and I think to properly internationalize psychology, it needs to incorporate the research and opinions of psychologists in those countries, and who have their own views of what should be in the curriculum, what should be taught, what should be the research topics, and so on. That can be quite, that, you know, internationalizing the curriculum should not just include cross-cultural findings from the literature, but really go into the field and get, as Yoga was saying, also listen to people, get their responses and so on, and have a real dialogue about what kind of discipline do we want? How do we make it incorporated so that it becomes truly international, with the voices and the theoretical understandings and the indigenous perspectives and indigenous psychology of different cultures, you know. So I would really highly recommend incorporating indigenous psychology as well as cross-cultural sort of ETIC findings, that is getting indigenous perspectives as well.
Right. Well, we have one more question here from Joe Geary. On the subject of colonization destroying our history, I wonder, does it destroy our future? Mark Fisher has written about this, that global capitalist realism has spread so widely that it's hard to imagine any countervailing forces against it.
It's certainly destroying the future with climate change.
Yeah. Yes, I definitely have to read some of Mark Fisher's work. I have not, but that's an interesting question. I tend to be an optimistic person and also a realist. So I would dare to say that, you know, with awareness, we need to make changes, and we need to make them fast. Even just the example of climate change, that we hope that we'll be able to slow, so the rapid progression that we're seeing, and that we'll be able to change the future. So I don't want to give up on the future, but I know that we have a lot of obstacles ahead of us to make those changes.
Yeah, and I also think that psychologists actually do have a role to play here. Psychologists always tend to stay in the background and think that they should deal with the individual in terms of mental health. But psychologists can say a lot about can come forward and do a lot of activism. Not active. What I mean is utilizing psychological tools to change people's attitudes and talk and deal with this issue and communicate across cultures and so on. So psychology has a lot to offer as well. So future is not that bleak.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for your presence, for your presentations, and your comments. It was really rich, and I'm sure it was really important for every one of us who were here. And I'd like to thank also everyone who attended this webinar, and remembering that we will be able to watch it in our website, icpweb.org, and also in our YouTube channel. Elena.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Rashmi and Arukar. I think it's, well, this webinar shows, just like the previous ones that we watched, that there is no 0-1 binary thing in culture. There are no only traditional or only modern societies. There are frequently continua in many of these aspects that you tackled. I especially like this individualism versus collectivism. It's also not a 0-1 or the perception of self, and especially morality. It's a very, very dynamic thing. So actually, many cultures share the very similar values in the past, and some changed. Well, most changed, so on different pace, in different circumstances. So it's very interesting when you look, when you read the books from 30 years ago, what concepts were there, even in one culture, how things change and how they become more relevant. What I like very much, somebody wrote here about the experience working in a camp, multicultural group of people, is that what I think we need to take from this, as from all the other webinars, is to be open for learning. That's something that is very important. And I think that's overarching all the cultures. It's not a culture specific. We really, and it's very challenging. That's how That's what we've learned. So let me share the last slide, which contains the information that you have been asking during this webinar as well. So thank you to the audience for joining us. This webinar was recorded or is being recorded, and it will be available and it will be posted on the Global Network of Psychologists for Human Rights website. You can see it here. So probably tomorrow or in the next couple of days. Mary will do that. She's great with that. Then the next announcement is that you will get your certificates of attendance if you automatically, so you don't have to request them. You will get them automatically on the email address from which you registered. If you had attended the webinar for at least 40 minutes. What we would like you to do is to provide us with some feedback. This is necessary. This is very much appreciated, because then we will see how to shape our next webinars, how to choose topics, and how to formulate, how to assign the length of the speech and the part for the discussion as well. So you can provide us with some very useful ideas, and thank you for that. I think the one last thing is to announce our next webinar, which will take place in 2 months in April. Our speakers will be Dr. George Ulrich and Dr. Tony Wainwright. They will be talking about human rights and the professional psychology identity. So some of you said, how do we do things? This is very new for us, connecting human rights and psychology. How do we learn about it? We are learning. This is the way of learning, sharing the experience and what some people have searched so far, what they experienced so far. So this is our next topic. Our moderator will be Eme Karam. Thank you very much for joining and attending. Thank you, Mary, for being the great support. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.